All right, so welcome to this presentation of the top trends in machine learning, AI, and data. This is the mad landscape. So we are investors at FirstMark, early stage venture firm here in New York, and organizer, obviously, of this event for the last 11 years, as well as the authors and publishers of this annual report that we call The Mad. But first and foremost, very active investors in the space. So we've had the distinct privilege of working with some great companies there. So we started this again 2012. The idea at the time was like, wow, this thing called big data, and wow, there are so many different just like moving parts, and it's hard to understand, and there's so many vendors. We thought we would do one of those like Lumascape kind of things for our own benefit to sort of make sense of the ecosystem. And this was the first version back in 2012, 139 companies, which felt like a lot of companies at the time. But of course, fast forward to 2023, and this is what it looks like. A lot more company, 1,416. We could have easily fit in, another 1,400 on this without much of a problem. So we actually had to be very opinionated in how we organized this. At a high level, it's a little bit of a tale of two cities or two worlds, where the world of data infrastructure had a super exciting last 3-4 years, but has slowed down quite a bit. Meanwhile, in the world of ML and AI, it's a party like it's 1999. Kevin is going to get started, so you're going to start, I guess, with the bad news. I guess you're probably bad cop and I'm good cop. This is where we landed.
Love being
all right.
Bad cop. All right, so on a macro level, things are not looking good. So as anyone with a Robinhood account probably knows. So if we just look at S&P drawdowns of 19%, but in our world of data infrastructure AI, of which there aren't a ton of public companies, we're seeing drawdowns of 51%, so much more significant. And if we look at some of the 2021 high flyers, some of which are listed, seeing market caps collapse way more than 50. And so not great news to start. And then that has kind of spilled over to the startup world as well. Broadly, venture funding has slowed down both in terms of deal counts as well as deal values. And that isn't super different in kind of, again, our universe of machine learning, AI, and data. So compared to 2021, less deal counts, less deal values per deal. And this is more acute at the growth level or growth stage, where investors are comparing late stage startups with public companies. And so what we're seeing is, for the kind of truly exceptional category leaders, category definers, deals are still getting done, companies are still getting funded, but it's much more farther and fewer in between. And so what does that functionally mean for startups, how we operate? So things like rifts are starting to happen. Things like a focus on sustainable growth, that's back in the dictionary, which wasn't the case in 2021 and the second half of 2020. Startups have to deal with black swan events like the SVB stuff last week. And then for us venture investors as well, there's a renewed focus on corporate governance, which also wasn't a thing, and less skiing in Aspen.
Every single time over the last few years, when we talk about this landscape, the question is always like, okay, there's so many companies. How many more companies can there be? Surely there's going to be consolidation. And every year so far, we said actually it should happen, but it's not going to happen, in part because VCs keep funding those companies and nobody really wants to sell. So the big question is whether that's finally going to happen, this consolidation. If you look at the market map, and I'm saying this with love because I'm a big believer in the space and the opportunity, and I'm also friends with a lot of the founders, and I'm also investor in a lot of companies. But the reality is that you have a bunch of overcrowded categories where you have, sort of that typical startup which has smart founders, a nice product positioning, but ultimately is a very young company that will be below 5, 10, 15 million in ARR, that raised a bunch of money at a very high valuation and just hasn't had a lot of time to grow into this valuation before the market changed. There's dozens and dozens of those on the market, and it's very unclear how many of those the market is going to be able to sustain. Basically, what that means is that you're going to have some companies, some young startups that are going to emerge as leaders, and they're going to make it, and they're going to be great. But you're going to have a bunch of other companies that are not. And, what that means is that they'll need to hopefully find a home, but that's not going to be the kind of, M&A home run that all the founders and all the VCs who love them were hoping for. That's going to be, in my opinion, some tuck-ins. There's going to be a lot of like private on private kind of like merger to create companies with a broader offering. Ultimately, that's pretty Darwinian, but from the customer perspective, ultimately that's, I think, pretty good because you'll end up with companies that offer more things, do more things. It'll be simpler. You'll be able to just pick a vendor or two or three, and those vendors will offer a lot of different, functionality. Not to pick on them, but I think there are certain categories which are, feeling more crowded than others. In my opinion, data quality, data observability, which is a wonderful opportunity and very much a needed functionality. I think there's just a little too many companies. I think MLOps in general, there's just in our chart, there's probably 25, 30 companies in MLOps. That's probably going to consolidate. But anyway, that's where we are. Another important trend is that concept of modern data stack that we had talked about. The issue is when you have a bunch of different vendors like this, plus in addition, when you have at the core of it, the data warehouse that, yes, can ingest a lot of data, but will make you pay to process it and compute it. All of this gets very expensive. And as per the above, we've now switched to a version of the world where the CFO is breathing down your neck and asking for ROI, asking for general cost control. And, in that world, do you need to store all the data that you produce? Do you need to have this whole assembly line? A couple of things happening worth noting. I think there's a trend. I don't know how big it will be, but I think that's kind of interesting. This emergence of fully managed data platforms that quite often abstract away a lot of those vendors into just one interface. So you deal with one vendor, one contract, and you don't have to worry about the stitching. So that's the companies on the right side. And then there's the acceleration of alternative architectures, storage. Why don't you just dump everything in S3, which is very cheap? And then, you could use Iceberg on top to add some structure to it. We talked about DuckDB that, will enable you to process it, and Trino to search it. Different architectures are coming up, which may be an alternative to this modern data stack. None of this is overnight. It's been percolating for a while, but in a context where cost matters, that's been accelerating. My overall sense, talking to a bunch of you guys, actually, and vendors in the space and customers, is that there is a clear need, but also a clear trend towards convergence and simplification. So we just had our friends at SurrealDB a minute ago, which is a part of that is abstraction category. I don't know if that's the ideal term for it, but that's the term I use. I'm also seeing stuff around the intersection between transactional and OLAP or analytics, which is something that people have been talking about for a long time. There's been capabilities, but there's new acceleration in that space. Why would you need multiple products to do different things? Could you do most of it with one product? Snowflake made some announcements there. Google released a product called AlloyDB, which is going in that direction, which I think is interesting as well. I'm also seeing convergence between batch and real time. So real time is the thing that everybody's been excited about for 10 plus years. And every year people say, this year is going to be the year of real time. It seems to be trending in that direction. But regardless, the bottom line is that if you're a customer, you have to deal with one stack that's going to do batch, and then a different stack with different databases and different sort of ETL tools and all the things for real time, which is very painful, and it feels like those words should be converging. Not to be the VC that plugs their own companies, but of course I will have a investment in the space. A company called Estuary that spoke at this event, maybe 3 or 4 events that thinks along those lines. So that is the database world, the data world, and the world of databases as well, which, it feels like we are in this phase of digestion after a lot of excitement, a lot of energy, a lot of investment in the space. Different time, different sort of vibe, I guess. Still very exciting, but, it's a little bit of a hangover and we're digesting. Now, in the world of AI, for me, in addition to all the super exciting parts of this, for me, the moment is really AI going mainstream. So if you spend time in AI circles, people actually had been talking about GPT-3 for 2 years or 3 years, whenever it came out, and were incredibly excited about it. But GPT-3 was a dev tool. Like, you had to be a developer, you had to have access and all the things. And like ChatGPT and to some extent DALL-E before that, Stable Diffusion before that, was really the moment when the broad public got a sense for, holy shit, this thing is really powerful and just very different, and had this very visceral reaction to those tools. All the things, right? Like ChatGPT is basically the fastest growing product ever, and GPT-4 that was released yesterday is just even more powerful now. ChatGPT passed the bar, some elements of the bar, but basically performed better than 10% of human lawyers, and now GPT-4 apparently is in 90th percentile, beating 90% of lawyers. Mainstream, but also very much multimodal, which I think is something that really caught people's imagination. So you had this whole evolution, which again is just, a few months last year, where like every month, every week, there's a new product that got started, where now with AI, you could create not just text, but you could create code, and you could create images, and you could create videos. This, as I'm sure a lot of you know, that's the famous image created by an artist using Midjourney that won the Colorado State Fair competition, which obviously created all sorts of controversy, but this is a quality of image. And this is my avatar. So I'm an investor in a company called that enables you to create video with AI, including avatars, and then using those videos for training and onboarding and customer communication.
Hi, I am a Matt Turck avatar created by Synthesia. I hope you're enjoying reading the MAD 2023. It sure took some time to put together. I asked ChatGPT if it could help, but it said, buddy, that's way too much to write. And I tried Stable Diffusion for the landscape, but no luck. So I had to use my usual unpaid interns and ghostwriters instead.
You get it. Like, I never stood in front of a camera to do this. This was purely based on text. So I created my avatar with Synthesia, just like standing in front of a camera. And now I can speak 60 languages. All of this crazy performance of AI is obviously leading to massive interest in investing, a bunch of new companies. Those are more questions than statements, but there is a really interesting discussion around the new political economy of AI, which is really the big tech companies versus the labs. Big tech has decided that AI is like the key strategic battlefield. Obviously, you've all seen the search wars of, ChatGPT versus Bard and all the things. That's just starting. To give credit where credit is due, as you may very well know, a lot of this generative AI stuff and AI in general actually comes from those companies. So in GPT, which stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers, the T is a transformer architecture that was actually developed at Google. And the irony is that Google is playing catch up to Microsoft and OpenAI right now, because OpenAI accelerated the development of a technology that was actually created by Google. There is like this new rapidly emerging world of independent research labs, which, by the way, all want to get us to AGI, artificial general intelligence. AI is obviously the most famous one. You could argue that OpenAI should sit in the column on the left, given the very close relationship that they have with Microsoft. But, will those become the new cloud vendors? Or will they be outcompeted by the big tech companies on the left? That's a fascinating question. Will they eat up the application layer That's another fascinating question. Academia, as of now, has just completely lost the battle in AI research and development. The darker dots, and this is a long time scale at the bottom, show that in the early years of the current wave, a lot of the research came out of academia, but today it's pretty much all industry. I'm going to talk quickly about, okay, what does that mean in terms of opportunities for all of us as founders, as investors, or as people that may choose to work for one of those companies. So that's hotly debated, everywhere. Everybody's asking themselves the same questions. Does big tech have too much of a headway, of an advantage or a head start? And it's going to be very hard for startups to catch up. Can you build a really interesting company on top of OpenAI, or will OpenAI eventually outcompete you? The typical example that people talk about a lot is Jasper, that enables you to write email marketing. A lot of people say, well, that's just a thin layer on top of OpenAI. That's what people say. I actually don't know Jasper. Personally, I don't know the founders. You could argue it either way, but that's one of the key questions that's being discussed. In my opinion, people think about this probably a little too much. Those companies are very new, and I think those companies need more time on earth to demonstrate that they can build a competitive advantage. Arguably, the competitive advantage is actually not going to be AI, but the competitive advantage is going to be the workflow and the collaboration that you build on top of the AI to do those things, which I think is not any more or less interesting than your typical SaaS company. A second part of the opportunity, so you can have the application or you can have the infrastructure. So there's like this awkwardly named category called LLMOps, in a world where you have ops for everything, like RevOps and FinOps and DevOps, certainly. Now you used to have MLOps, now you have LLMOps, and everybody's trying to figure out whether there's real value to be taken there, or again, whether big tech or the cloud vendors will capture that value. Starting to see interesting things. There's a category of vector databases that are particularly adapted to this, processing unstructured data. There is a little bit of a layer on top that's starting to emerge. So they were a funding announcement. There was a company called LangChain. There's a company called Dust, and sort of providing the Lego blocks that one needs to basically leverage your own context.
Back to the doom and gloom stuff. I promise I'm like a fun guy, but as we've hopefully proven in the last half an hour, AI is very powerful. It's kind of permeating society, how we do work much faster than we expected. And so as a result of that, there's that inevitable backlash against AI. So you have things like AI bias, you have things like hallucination, you have things like how do we deal with copyright for AI generated content, et cetera, or AI companies getting sued because of where their underlying training data comes from. And so what is the response from industry, from the public, from the government? That's open question. And so maybe one example of how or where these conversations are taking place is the EU AI Act. So that's a framework for really understanding the regulations around AI systems, as well as understanding the risks of AI. So then going forward, the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see a lot more of those conversations. Zooming out in a more kind of geopolitical lens, what's unavoidable right now is kind of the AI wars, right, between America and China. And so at the application layer, you have government employees being banned from using TikTok across various government branches. You have the American Chips Act, which is a series of subsidies and capital to incentivize semiconductor companies to reshore, onshore their semiconductor production, fabrication. But that comes with strings attached of how these companies conduct business in China, IP transfer, and all those things, right? And the other thing is China gets their counterpunch, right? So example of that is More Threads, which is a Chinese GPU maker that recently raised their Series A. I think it's like over 200 million, and they've raised over 500 million altogether, right? So GPUs are, so it's on the bottom left. They are graphics processing units, which machine learning engineers use to do training and inference. And so as China's access to Western technology gets cut off, they're trying to have this homegrown indigenous system. And so right now, they're still a couple generations behind. They have driver issues. It's not as performant.
If anybody has thoughts, suggestions, or possibly complaints that their company is not appearing on the MAD 2023, we created a special email address for those. So MAD2023 at FirstMarkCap.com. Again, those are the links. And that's it. Big part of this effort is sharing, starting a conversation, meeting folks, and if you want to share or comment or like any of the things, that's always appreciated. Kevin and I learn a lot that way, and we came across all sorts of companies that we hadn't heard about, and people that agree or disagree with some of the trends. But for purposes of this kind of like whirlwind tour of trends, obviously we could dig into all of this at a very high level, but hopefully that gives you a sense for like the various moving pieces that we see in this ecosystem. So that's it. Thank you very much.